Chapter 4. Rohan. I was in love with this world, with this city, with this beautiful sunny morning, and the salt breeze wafting off the Pacific. I almost wanted to take another trip around the block just to bask in the bustle of humanity around Santa Monica. But the guys were waiting, so I dutifully carried my haul back to the Dragon Scale to deliver it. The door jingled as I opened it. I loved music, even little bells. "Breakfast is served," I announced, pushing through and letting the door swing closed behind me. Nobody moved or said a thing, which was odd, because I'd have at least expected Keegan to be drooling on me the second I walked in, already rifling through the bag and pulling out an everything bagel, then swiping the locks. I had to get 2 of everything, 1 for him and 1 for everyone else. The man was a beast. By the time I made it around the counter and deposited the bagels onto the corner table, the 3 of them still hadn't budged, and my empathic nature clued me in that mood in the room was distinctly interested in something. Keegan was propped back against the checkout counter, his attention following something in the store, and both Willem and Sandor were leaning on the glass top behind the register, just as transfixed. I handed out coffees, which my apparently hypnotized friends accepted wordlessly and began to drink. I leaned close to Keegan and in an exaggerated whisper said, "What's up, dude?" He tilted his scruffy chin toward the store at large. I didn't see her at first, as I scanned the racks of instruments and shelves of sheet music. Then she stood up beyond one of the shelves, her dark hair shining in an ebony cascade over her brown shoulders. She was holding a guitar. My heart skipped a beat. "Who is she?" I asked, barely able to breathe. "Better question is, why is she here?" Sandor asked. "Humans don't come into this store. The door's warded to repel them." "Maybe she's a member of the bloodline," Willem said. "The wards may not work on them now." "How would it be any different than before?" I asked. "They're still human, right?" I couldn't take my eyes off the woman as she reverently caressed the neck of the guitar. My cock roused at the sight, and I let out a faint, involuntary grunt. Keegan side-eyed me and lifted one dark brow. "They are more than human as of the equinox," Willem said. I glanced at him, my eyes wide. "How's that?" The big white-haired dragon was the oldest of our group. It had managed to escape the last dragon renunciation and gone into hiding in a Turul enclave for 5 centuries. Now that the Dragon Council had pardoned all the dragons who hadn't committed the mandatory ritual suicide, he was finally free to live his life after more than 1,500 years. He and Sandor owned the Dragon Scale. They were like brothers, closer even. Kind of like me and Keegan, I supposed. Fuck buddies with emotional benefits. Or I figured as much, as I hadn't seen a dragon mark on Sandor yet. But they could also just be old-fashioned. It was only within the past year that it had become kosher for Turul and dragons to mate each other. "I think you know as well as I do, Rohan," Willem said. "Not all the members of the bloodline were human to start with." Our gazes held for a moment longer before I swallowed and turned away. I'd never told anyone what I'd experienced on the equinox 3 weeks ago. I'd woken up that morning particularly energized, as though the sex I'd had with Keegan the night before had given me a double dose of magic. But the strange thing was that it hadn't faded, even after I'd shifted and flown and used my powers. It still clung to me. The warning we'd received a couple days prior to that night seemed connected. It had been delivered on the wind in Turul fashion, warning us to lie low until after equinox. Then the message had arrived shortly after. It had sounded like it was meant for humans, not dragons like me. If our leaders had planned a ritual to somehow control the bloodline, this dark beauty's unexpected appearance in the store had to be a consequence. "Rohan, you really need to pay more attention," Sandor said, shaking his head. "Willem's been waiting for you to get it." I shrugged. I don't like to overthink things. So what if I'm part of the bloodline too? "It was your mother, wasn't it?" Keegan asked gently. "You said she was an Ultiori defector. That's how you wound up with some of the Lamia's blood. All the Ultiori were infused with it." I returned my attention to the woman, offering only a half shrug to my big Ursa friend. So I had a dark ancestry, but that was the past. Suddenly, what Willem and Sandor had both said hit me, and I turned to stare. You too? Sandor chuckled and muttered something about dumb blondes that I chose to ignore. Willem nodded solemnly. The first ascension, there were quite a few more defectors. My great-great-grandmother chose a former Old Tiori soldier for a mate. He'd served under Nikhil himself. So, you and I are both part of the bloodline too, even though we're dragons. You heard the message, didn't you? Willem said. Keegan stood up straighter, at least 3 inches taller than me at full height. You two got a message? From who? I shrugged. From the council, or whatever they're calling themselves now that all our leaders have hooked up. The quantum? I can't fucking keep track. But it was meant for the humans who carry the blood. Like we were all copied on the same email. Keegan snorted, probably because I'd only just grasped how email worked after nearly 2 years of him trying to teach me. As an Ursa on his pilgrimage, he'd spent a lot more time in the human world than I had. I'd spent the bulk of the last 5 centuries in hibernation. From the leaders of the higher races, Willem supplied, otherwise known as the Quorum. The 2 of you weren't involved in the war, but Sandor and I were in the Haven at the end. Dionysus sacrificed his power to subvert the Lamia's hold on her victims and to facilitate her death at Nikhil's hand. It's the god's blood that runs through the bloodline now, instead of our enemies, and divine blood comes with some side effects, not the least of which is that the bloodline now has the ability to recognize the higher races for what we are. Hence the message, I said, finally catching on. Hence the message. Willem agreed. He tilted his chin at the woman. So, either she is bloodline, or she's one of us. But I can't for the life of me decide which.